as promised. This is part 2 of the covenant. Just to recap a little bit, last week we talked about God appearing to Abraham and promising to him that his descendants would be more numerous than the stars in the heavens. And then that promise was repeated to Isaac, and then to Jacob as well. And this morning we'll pick it up in the 35th chapter of Genesis, starting with the 9th verse, and I'll read through the 15th verse. After Jacob returned from Paddan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will come from your body. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you." Then God went up from him at the place where he had talked with him. Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil on it. Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel. This promise is like the promise to Abraham, repeating many of the same words. And as we talked last week, Jacob had 12 sons, but his favorite son was Joseph. Now, Joseph was the older son of Rachel. Rachel had 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, but Joseph was the older son, and he was the favored son, and probably the son who was given the blessing by Jacob. But we don't know that for sure, simply because Joseph was waylaid by his other brothers and cast into a pit. Then fortunately rescued from that pit, and Joseph is taken down to Egypt, wherein initially Joseph was a slave. He was put into prison, but then he was called upon by Pharaoh to interpret a dream. And his interpretation was so prophetic that Pharaoh eventually promoted him to be the ruler of Egypt, under, of course, Pharaoh's direction. And then there was a famine in Canaan. So Jacob sent Joseph's brothers down to Egypt to get food so they could survive the famine. And so this wonderful story unfolds where the 11 brothers appear to Joseph, but many years have gone by and they don't recognize Joseph. But Joseph, of course, knows who they are. And fortunately, because Joseph is there, the brothers are treated well. And eventually, all 11 brothers, along with Jacob, now known as Israel, relocate to Egypt and are given their own portion of land called Goshen. And that whole family relocates to Egypt. Now becomes one of the fascinating periods of history. We don't know precisely how long the Israelites were in Egypt, but it was probably somewhere on the order of 300 to 400 years. If you go from the end of Genesis into Exodus and the appearance of Moses, you have about a period of 300 to 400 years. And early in Exodus, we're told that the leadership in Egypt has changed, and the Israelites have gone into slavery in Egypt. Well, this is a troubling time. And it's hard to fathom how this all would take place. But I've given this a lot of thought. And it was all of it was part of God's plan. First, it's important to understand how slavery operated in ancient times. It was slaves in ancient time could be more looked upon as servants. Even though the Israelites were set apart, it's important to understand that a large percentage of the general population were slaves. They were there to serve royalty and to serve the leadership of the community. But as I see it, God recognized a couple of important points. First of all, he had guaranteed to Abraham and to Jacob and that they would take over the land of Canaan. Well, in order to do that, they needed a much larger population than just the family of Jacob. I mean, he had 12 sons, and, if each one of those had 7 or 8 children, that's still less than 100. And you're not going to invade a place like Canaan with a force of 100. You need many, many, many more. And along with that, you had the need for a large group of people. But then, just as important, those people needed to have a shared purpose, a shared history. So God put them in service to the Egyptians, and over the period of 300 or 400 years, they developed their own sense of who they are. They developed their own traditions. Excuse me. And most importantly, they built a sufficient critical mass. Finally, along comes Moses, and you're familiar with the story of Moses. His mother puts him in a basket in the Nile River, and because of Pharaoh, the Israelites had become so numerous that Pharaoh had ordered that male children would be terminated upon birth. So his mother, fearing that, puts the child in a basket in the river, and he is rescued by one of Pharaoh's daughters. And he is raised as an Egyptian. But his mother is hired as a handmaiden to Pharaoh's daughter. And as he grows up, Moses comes to realize that he is in truth an Israelite. And he gets into some trouble with the law for defending one of the Israelites in a confrontation with an Egyptian, and Moses has to flee. And we know that story of the burning bush and God's call upon Moses to free his people. There's an ancient, old, black spiritual that goes, "Go down, Moses, way down to Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." So Moses becomes the leader of the Israelites, with the assignment of leading them out of Egypt, doesn't know where. And we have that epic story that we all remember so well from the movie, The Ten Commandments, which still gets shown on TV even now. But it's an epic story. And for 40 years, the Israelites wander in the wilderness. It's an epic story. It is so epic that it has to be real. No one could invent such an epic story. And over those 40 years, of course, the Israelites continued to increase in population. They are more isolated than ever. Well, the advantages in God's sight are tremendous. They're isolated. They come to depend more and more on one another. They know each other better, so that when the time finally comes for them to be led out of the wilderness and into Canaan, they are a people unified, strengthened, and blessed with new leadership. 40 years is particularly significant because that represents a generation of, a whole generation of folks. And one of the theories of biblical scholars is God recognized that it would take 40 years for old habits learned while the Israelites were in Egypt, for those old habits to die out and for the people to come to have a shared understanding of who they were and what their mission was. And by the time they go to Canaan, they're 40,000 plus. And the Canaanites didn't have a prayer. You see, another way of looking at it is the Israelites were in a joint venture with God. God spoke to them through Moses, but it's understandable that there would be a fair amount of dissension over a period of 40 years. And that dissension included turning to other gods, the story of the golden calf. It's just an incredible part of Jewish history. was all part of God's plan. And I want you to understand that that same plan continues today. Just as surely as we're sitting here this morning. When I read contemporary news reports of declines in church membership, that Christianity today represents less than a majority of the American people, that doesn't bother me a bit. It's part of God's plan. And we're to have confidence and trust that that will all work out. That there will be a bright and new day. Just as surely as the Israelites leaving Egypt, spending 40 years in the wilderness, and then finally occupying Canaan. So turn to somebody nearby you and say, hey, it's all part of God's plan and I'm in the middle of it.